Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, the show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. If you're looking for a podcast to keep you informed and ahead of the game in business, the GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Paula DuPont, and today we've got a variety of topics to talk about, not really related at all, except that it's all business news. The first of which is about Tesla, which has been making headlines at the start of this week and a little bit this weekend, given Elon Musk's propensity for Twitter. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about online funerals. We're going to talk about video game industry, what it's going to take for people to come back into the office, how our office is being refitted, retrofitted, and a couple other things as well. So we're going to get started in just a moment. So, as I said, we are going to talk about Tesla and its illustrious CEO, Elon Musk, who took to Twitter this weekend and basically criticized Alameda County Public Health Department for its decision or guidance to reopen on May 18th. And Musk said, no, that's not going to work. It's not fair. And the county has said that it's been waiting to have Tesla's submission of its plan of how it was going to configure its factory for the assembly line and to make sure that workers' safety was going to be considered and developed into this plan. And Tesla has not submitted that plan, at least as of this point in time that I'm talking about it. And in fact, there were some nasty exchanges, or at least heading in the direction of Alameda County. And ultimately, not only did Elon Musk threaten to move his business to Texas, but he said he had since said, I believe earlier on Monday, that they were going to reopen anyway. So despite the rules, he said that he was going to open his plant. And as of the end of the day, Monday, he had in fact done that, or at least that was what was reported, that he did open the plant. So there is concern about employee safety. Apparently, many workers were furloughed from the plant. That in one case I saw, and I'm not sure if this is still accurate, there were 10,000 employees at that plant. I don't know if that's still the case or still the case being before the pandemic hit. But we're talking quite a few workers. And this is a very large plant. Apparently it has over 4 million square feet, and it's where they produce all of the different models of Tesla cars. And again, it's the only one in the U.S. So one of the things that I thought was interesting in an article that I read was that Tesla claims that they have stimulated $5.5 billion in sales activity, and they generate $4.1 billion in direct spending in the state of California. So if you hadn't heard that little piece of context before in other reports about this threat that Musk is making, that's a significant factor. I mean, when you consider what the impact would be to the local economy and to the state of California in general. I mean, it's a pretty big piece of pie that I'm sure they don't want to lose to Texas. One of the other things that Elon Musk has been critical of is the governor, Gavin Newsom's, his guidance, which is basically saying from the state's point of view that factories could open, but he deferred to the counties basically for them to make this decision, per what's right for the county. So there's been some criticism that the governor should get involved and that this should be overturned, this decision by the local health authority. To me, it sounds pretty reasonable that the health department would require some sort of plan to ensure worker safety. I mean, that's the whole point. It was shut down to begin with, along with every other business where more than one person works. And, you have throughout the country other companies being required, depending on where they are and who they answer to, are required to have some sort of plan in place. Now, how enforceable the plan is, how prescriptive those plans are, I'm not really sure. But I think when you're talking about a factory setting, certainly with some of the issues that have arisen with Amazon, for instance, Amazon workers had complained about the conditions that they worked in their facilities. It's not far-fetched to see why workers would be concerned going back into an environment if it was exactly like they left it, which incidentally, it was another controversial thing. Musk did not close the plant right away when he was required to. He waited days later after the state had ordered it and after the county had ordered it. I believe it was around March 26th or something like that, where he eventually closed it. So basically the plant's been shut down since the end of March and then, of course, all of April. And, like a lot of businessmen, he's anxious to get it up and running. I'm not sure that he's any different than any other CEO in that regard. However, there is at least a broader recognition that things can't go back to the way they were. And it would be hard to believe that that the Tesla plant would be exactly as it was before, especially considering, how cutting edge the company is and, takes pride in it's on their website about how it's supposed to be one of the most advanced assembly plants in the world, at least according to them. And it would be hard to consider them being anything less than state of the art when it comes to safety and guarding people's health. So it'll be interesting what happens in the days to come and what, if any, repercussions there might be to Musk for opening his plant. In other places in this country where people have defied governor's rules, there has been a backlash. There have been repercussions. In Maine, for instance, now this is obviously on a much smaller scale, but a local bar owner decided to open his bar and advertised and had no space limits, did not require masks. He opened his bar and was open about doing that, and as I said, promoted it. But the state came back, and I believe they took his liquor license and they basically shut them down. And, I got to think that'll probably happen in some other areas where people are defying it. And it's probably easier to do to a small businessman, a small bar, than it would be to a Tesla plant. But we shall see. So that's it for now. But stay tuned. I'm sure there will be more on that at another point. Well, we're going to pause for a brief commercial break. And when we come back, I have a couple points to share from an article I saw that helps to put a little context around what is a depression versus what we're going through now, and how the circumstances right now, although often equated with the Great Depression, is it really? So more on that in a moment.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
So this is a presumption on my part, but I think I'm pretty safe to say that most of us listening to this podcast were not around during the Depression, the Great Depression as they call it, which, what was so great about it? It's like sarcasm on the history scale, the Great Depression. We don't even use that word in talking about describing this period of time. The most prevailing term that I hear is the economic downturn that we're going through. A little more cumbersome to say, but not as scary as saying depression, because for those of us who have studied it or looked back at pictures and accounts of the Great Depression, the images are stark and rattling, and so aptly define what a depression is when you think about what an emotional depression is and what it was, economically to the country. I mean, I guess it was collectively our nation's mental health that was depressed at the time. And, the images, there's a famous image of a mother who's trying to nurse her baby, and she's got her other children around her. It's a black and white photo, and just very grim and stark, and she looks pale and drawn, and she was in a rural area where there just weren't many resources. And there weren't as many resources at that time as there are now, or at least I'd like to think that there are. And a recent article that I read points to the fact that we do have things in place that we didn't at that time. And hopefully that will make an impact. Now, what is a bit troubling is you have food banks that are running dry, and they'll start off with a number of boxes of food to hand out and have a huge turnout for them. People that they didn't expect would have food insecurity issues are showing up in droves. And you've had places, I've seen in the news where, you have cars lined up for miles to drive up and get their provisions. So that is scarily something that is somewhat similar. However, back in the late 1920s, early 30s, there was no unemployment. And that is something that we have now. Of course, that doesn't address everybody and not everybody who's hungry, but we do have that in place now, unemployment insurance, which when you're working, part of that money goes towards paying for support if you are out of a job. Then in addition to that, there is the $600 a week subsidy payment that the federal government makes in addition to the state applied unemployment. So, and speaking of unemployment, that's of course one of the biggest areas where we see some kind of similarity to the Great Depression. We saw that in April, the United States hit 14.7% unemployment, and we're considering that it's probably going to be even greater after the month of May is over. Although with some businesses starting to open up, hopefully we're going to plateau at some point in the middle of May, and perhaps at some point we'll start to see a decline in unemployment, or better said, more employment. So I think overall that's one of the biggest differences. While the Depression occurred over a period of time, and I think it took like 43 consecutive months to stabilize the economy, economists now are not expecting us to have to wait that long before we get back to pre-pandemic kind of numbers. And initially, at the beginning of this whole thing, there were some experts who were saying that we would see like a V-shaped curve, where as steep and sharp as the decline is or was, would be as steep and sharp the incline would be in coming back. In other words, right after we get back to work and the restrictions are lifted. Now, in fact, just today, I saw a couple pieces of coverage that talked about the economy curve looking more like a swoosh, like the Nike swoosh or check mark, where you have the steep decline on the one side and a more gradual but steady incline on the other side as far as the recovery. And that would be a contrast as well to the Great Depression, which again took a really long time to come back from. Also, another thing that is different is that the International Monetary Fund estimates the world economy shrank about 10% during the Great Depression. versus an expectation of about 3% this year and an expected return to growth next year. So, no one really knows, of course, not even economists and brilliant people who are looking at this, because, as I said, there were many who predicted a V-shaped recovery curve and are backing away from that now. So we haven't really been in this exact situation before. It's kind of the same danger in comparing this pandemic with the Spanish flu, because there were things that were different then, and that are hard to compare it to. So no one really knows, but I think overall the idea is that we have a lot more safety nets in place than we did before. And in fact, we owe the Great Depression for some of this support. In fact, if you check out the Federal Reserve Bank's website and also their YouTube channel, they have different educational videos that explain some of the things that were changed because of the Great Depression, where the bank, makes sure that the Federal Reserve makes sure that banks are accountable, that they're insured. Also, the fact that we're controlling the interest rate, which then sets the interest rates at banks. That's one of the things that came out of the Great Depression. And there are a number of other safeguards, too, that have come into play, again, as a response to the Depression. But I need to pause for a moment so we can take another commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about businesses cutting the cable cord. Back in a moment.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Hi, I'm back. And as I mentioned before, we're going to talk about businesses cutting the cable cord. If you recall, within the past couple of years, there were commercials on TV about, the signs that it's time to cut the cable cord. And it was done like they were little snippets of a horror movie, very menacing type scenarios, and where people are being shown the signs that it's time to break away. And a lot of households have done that. Probably not just because of the commercials, but because you have a lot of these other streaming channels that are available that you can watch with just an internet connection. And of course now with smart TVs, some of them are already loaded with some of these apps that you can then connect to if you have internet connection. So it's a struggle, and for these companies like AT&T's DirecTV, Comcast, Charter Communications, those are some of the big companies that provide that. And they have shown that with some recent numbers that came out that they've taken a dive, during the pandemic. They were losing customers beforehand, household customers and others, but obviously more dramatically since the pandemic hit, and you have restaurants and sports bars and hotel rooms sitting empty. And naturally, as these businesses are looking to cut their costs, and there's some things they absolutely have to pay, and then there's other things that, maybe they put on hold for a little bit, and that's what's happening with their cable connections. And so they've said that they have collectively lost more than 2 million customers in the first 3 months of this year, which is one of the sharpest declines that the industry has had on record. This, a few years ago seemed like the big growth industry. But again, with these streaming channels and Hulu and Netflix and, other channels that you can get just by having an internet connection and a smart TV or some sort of way to connect to the internet from the TV, the need for cable isn't as great. But when you consider right now, especially without sports, sports is a big driver, a big benefit of regular cable programming, and we don't have that. So that has really hit them hard. And, right now everything's so gray and unclear as far as the future of sports and when it'll come back. We know it will, but when and how is still not clear. Potentially, when you figure that, even if baseball, it looks like baseball's going to reopen at some point, but not to fans. And I've even heard that that's a possibility as well for football. You may be driving more people to TV than might not otherwise have it. So perhaps that will be a positive thing for them. But for right now, you have a lot of companies struggling, to pay their bills, and that's just not one of the higher priorities. And in fact, I believe AT&T has said that they have waived fees for some businesses to be able to just hold on their accounts and restart them once they're back in business. The problem, though, is that, for maybe a larger chain of hotels, they may be more able to resume the service and pay the bills, whereas some of the smaller venues, and as I said, like sports bars, for instance, or a restaurant, where they might be a standalone restaurant or sports bar, if they're getting PPP aid they're not using that money to pay their cable bill. In fact, they're more or less required to use a bulk of it to pay their employees. I know there's been a little bit of controversy around what some of these loans could be used for, while some small businesses would like to use them for other expenses and rents and supplies and electricity bills and other things like that. I'm not sure where that's landed. I think there have been some changes in the rules for those loans. I'm getting off track, but still, you're talking about a matter of priorities. And I guess we figured that, when you have businesses that are clamoring to survive and they have to make some serious decisions about what they can afford, cable's probably not going to be high on the list, yet may be vital to them when they are back in business, because that's what people will go to see, especially at a sports bar. We just need to make sure there's sports, of course. So just a couple other quick figures that I had. AT&T lost more than 1 million domestic pay TV customers in the first quarter and warned of more defections from cash-strapped households and businesses later this year. This, by the way, is according to a Wall Street Journal article. They have 413,000 fewer paying subscribers. Now, Comcast said that 409,000 customers canceled their pay TV subscriptions in the first quarter of this year, more than half of its total 2019 pay TV subscriber losses. So that's pretty significant. It does beg the question for the future of that industry, which, as I said, a couple years ago seemed like the big place to be. And, obviously a lot of competition. I know that in certain areas, Verizon has offered a deal to customers for internet only. And typically, if you've ever tried to negotiate just having internet service to your home, it's nearly impossible to get because it's always bundled. So it seems to me that the survival of this industry will be dependent on how they can adapt to all the streaming services. And there do seem like there's so many streaming services that to pay for each subscription, it starts adding up. And in some ways it's almost comparable to what you would have on a cable bill just to get, basic channels, but by the time you pay for all the other ones. So I don't know. I think they're going to have to find a way to adapt, and I'm sure they will, and they'll come out okay. So that's enough on that topic right now. We're going to have to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about video games.
Hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So I noticed that in doing these stories about businesses during this pandemic, the stories are either the company is doing really poorly, they're being hammered by the effects of the pandemic, or the industry is being hammered and it's just, bad timing. Or the other story is they're doing amazingly well, but dun dun dun. And if I had sound effects and access to them, this is where I would, to put in those eerie, dark, foreboding kinds of effects, to say that, with every positive story, there's always we don't know how we're going to do when this is over. I mean, and it stands to reason that, if you're doing exceptionally well because of the pandemic, what's going to happen when it's over? So one of those businesses or industries is for video games. And for those who know me, don't laugh. I know I have no business talking much in depth about video games because it's not something that I do. I am intrigued by it, and of course know and love many people who know and love video games and are regular players. So it's something that intrigues me. So they are doing really well during this time. And it makes sense given that you have that many more people sheltered at home, and they need some sort of release or entertainment, maybe something where they can commune with others, through the live networks to play games through. I'm assuming that there's other ones besides Xbox Live that allow you to do that. But that would make sense that, there's more people available to play and have that interest. And it does offer a good alternative to going out and interacting with the world, which we're not allowed to do right now. So a recent article that I saw, again in the Wall Street Journal, talks about how a number of the big companies, how they're doing and how they see some of the effects of this. Zynga, I think that's how you say it, mobile game maker, that they have seen a high number of reactivations. So a lot of people who used to play or used to be subscribers are now back in the game, and they've seen a big uptick in that. And they've seen that across all game categories that they have. Market research firm Edison Trends notes that online game spending in the first week of April was 11% higher than the previous peak during the past Christmas week. So there would be presumably a peak every year at Christmas time in sales. So April, the first week in April, was 11% higher than that Christmas buying time. Console game makers Electronic Arts and Activision Blizzard reported strong results for the March quarter, citing high engagement across titles that include everything from Call of Duty to World of Warcraft to EA's line of sports game such as Madden, NFL, and FIFA. And you figure, there's no sports. So people are turning to online sports or games, basically. So that's kind of as close as you get to it. Now, another thing that I think is kind of interesting and what I saw in this article or alluded to is the fact that you have kids home from school, teenagers home from high school, and they're at their computers and they're doing their work at their computers, right? I don't know at what point they seamlessly switch over and play video games, or if it's earned downtime that they go and get to do that. No statistics that I've seen so far that says how people have been neglecting the schoolwork in order to play games. But there is some correlation, though, in usage being up, with those, who would otherwise be in school if it weren't for the pandemic, the shutdown. Epic Games, who created Fortnite, said that the game now has more than 350 million registered players who logged more than 3.2 billion hours in the game during the month of April. It had last reported about 250 million players a little over a year ago. So 350 million registered players in the month of April compared to 250 million players over a year ago. So definitely some correlation there. Also, sales for actual consoles and for the hardware units has been up. Nintendo reported selling nearly 3.3 million Switch consoles in its fiscal fourth quarter, a March quarter record that was up 32% year over year. And the company had also launched a new version of its classic Animal Crossing game in late March. So now that probably was planned for a long time, and it just so happened to correlate with the staying in place orders. So kind of interesting, I thought. And a couple other things that were highlighted in this article that I saw is that, of course, the game company creators and CEOs are saying they're not sure what to expect when we go back to work and back to school and life goes back to whatever the new normal is. And that's a common theme, too. We see in a lot of these stories about businesses that are doing well. They don't know how they're going to do afterwards. And this is very typical for that. Especially, again, kind of like related to the story about cutting the cord with cable and how sports plays a role in that. And, what happens with sports coming back online, coming back on TV, and, will more people switch over from the video games to watching sports on TV? So, another interesting story of an industry that has been affected in a good way. So, interesting. So, we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what it might look like going back to work in the office.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hi, I'm back. So while you're listening to podcasts, and I'm listening to podcasts and recording some of them, we have human resource people, company lawyers, management, real estate, facilities people, probably risk assessment managers within companies, working together to try to come up with a plan about how they're going to reopen these companies in the near future, and have been working on this, I'm sure, for a while, virtually. but how they're going to reconfigure offices when they need to bring people back in. I guess it's a foregone conclusion that some companies are probably going to resist opening or won't rush to reopen offices for business as usual for a while when they have many who are successfully working from home. And so where that's working, that's, kind of a no-brainer to continue that situation. But for a lot of companies, you need to have people back in the office, and you need to have people working with one another in a face-to-face scenario, just a distant face-to-face scenario. And I believe in some states or counties within the states, there are sometimes requirements to submit a plan or be able to at least demonstrate how you're going to ensure the safety of your workers as well as customers or suppliers or anyone else who would interact with the workers at your company. So I saw something recently. Actually, there have been many things that I've seen about what workplaces are doing to get ready, including HP, Hewlett-Packard in Wuhan, China, when they reopened. Not only did they make a lot of physical changes to the location, but they gave a welcome kit to employees as they came in that gave every employee a face mask, a pair of gloves, and a bottle of hand sanitizer. I think that's awesome. That's great. And I'm wondering how they got all that. They must have connections. But I think that whether you get it in a nice little box with the company logo on it or not, those will probably be some essential pieces that everyone's going to have. And of course, right now that's somewhat subjective depending where you live about the face masks. But a lot of companies or a lot of county and state plans require that people wear face masks when they have to interact with others. In some states like Texas, they don't have to. They're not required to wear masks in public. I'm not sure if that still means a company can't require its employees to do that. A lot of interesting business ethics questions can come up in this discussion about what a company can make you do or not do. And really why anyone would oppose that, I'm not sure when it comes down to your own safety. Other than the fact that if you had to wear a face mask for 8 hours at your desk, it would probably be pretty uncomfortable. So I'm sure there's got to be consideration for that, that maybe you wear the face mask only when you're interacting with another employee. But going back again, I started to mention before, talking about a couple of recent office environments that I worked in. One recent company that I had worked for, and I won't say the name, but is a company that their main office environment is a very old manufacturing plant turned into offices. And it's the company has done a lot of cuts over the years and have eliminated different businesses. So there's a lot of space, and cubicles are very spread out. And there's sections of the floor that are completely empty. And so for a company like that, even though they didn't invest much in upgrading the facilities and, consolidating, which might have saved them some money, they might be actually better situated right now for social distancing with all that wide open space and a lot of empty cubicles. Perhaps they will space people out even more with more empty cubes in between rather than just in a clustered section. So I thought that was interesting because I'm thinking, well, in this particular case, maybe the fact that they did not upgrade and have more modern type cubicles and walls, it might work out to their advantage. I don't know. Certainly the cleaning aspect will still be a consideration, and I'm sure most companies are stepping up their cleaning efforts, and either voluntarily or they're being strongly guided to do so. The other company that I worked for recently, they were more on the cutting edge side in terms of office environment, where they had they were starting to move towards these open spaces with lower cubicle walls so that you could more easily talk to the person in the next cube. Cubes weren't as big. They were made more streamlined and small, and just make it easier for people to share and go back and forth to each other's cubicles without going down long hallways that you were clustered in these sections. They also started making certain work areas where there were almost like desk to desk cubicles, and where if you needed to collaborate with others, you had a teaming room where you had this kind of small room for small team meetings and brainstorming. And it did concern me at the time, thinking, I wasn't personally impacted by the much smaller workspaces, but when I saw that was happening, and saw that it was happening throughout, the business world, that a lot of companies were doing that to make more efficient use of space, it was just disconcerting, because it just doesn't seem to me like a good work environment to have people really close together. Well, now we have the corona impact, and that is going to, we're going to go in the other direction. I've heard that some companies are actually going to postpone opening their offices so that they can reconfigure the space and do things to make sure that desks and work centers are, at least 6 feet apart. In places and in companies that have already done some reconfiguring, what they're doing is putting X's on chairs and office space or workspaces to indicate that stays unused, unclaimed. They're doing things, some companies are doing things like limiting elevators to be only used by one person at a time, and actually drawing spaces inside the elevator to maybe show, exactly that this can only accommodate this one person. They're drawing spaces in the office place on the floor, like circles, to show that you shouldn't be within this circle if someone else is in that circle. So a lot of interesting things. Plexiglass dividers between workstations. We're certainly seeing that a lot in some public places with that shield coming up. A lot of things like that are happening, and also communal workspaces where people get together to have lunch or heat up their lunch. They're doing things to make those areas more sanitary, and provide supplies so that people can clean the surfaces that they use, and the dials on the microwaves and things like that. So there's going to be a lot of different approaches, but one thing's clear is they're going to have to do things differently to make everybody comfortable. So we're going to take another break, and when we come back in our last segment, we're going to talk about online funeral services.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hi. Well, I hope I didn't lose you when I said in this last segment that we're going to talk about the online funeral business. And maybe you didn't realize that was a business, but apparently it's kind of a new category within the funeral industry. And I know the topic might sound like a bit of a downer, and yeah, in a way it is. But in terms of a business, an innovative approach to business, I thought it was kind of interesting, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. Apparently, there are different companies that either will do an online type of live funeral service, or will do some planning for you or help you with planning a funeral type service. And so there's little variations on what they do. And apparently these existed before this current crisis that we're in. But naturally, given the situation, the very extraordinary situation that we find ourselves where, funeral homes can't keep up with the number of people coming to them, and it also creates a unique situation for those grieving the loss of their loved one, because they can't even get together physically to comfort each other and express condolences and all the things that you most need to do. Give a good hug, basically, when something like this happens. And so these businesses that I guess did exist before, they're really finding their niche right now, because they enable a way for people to come together and pay tribute and have prayers or some other way of recognizing the person who's passed. And one of the companies is called Gathering Us, and they host memorials on Zoom. They use Zoom to do it, and their services start about $1,400. And I believe they're a New York-based company, but they will guide you through creating a program to, that would include music and, the service, the live service, and then an opportunity for people to voice their tributes, their personal tributes about the person or their memories about the person. And I didn't see this in the article that I read about it, but I'm presuming that since Zoom has a record feature, that they can record the whole thing and be able to look at it again later. But when you consider the fact that when you do something online, it enables a lot more people to be able to participate who in, the otherwise real world may not be able to come. A lot of people who might want to, but because of work or other issues or distance, wouldn't be able to. And so this medium really provides a lot of other advantages that you wouldn't have otherwise in a traditional type funeral. They call this the online end of life business. And it's there. Some of what I had read about it was that there are people who would prefer having something done online than going physically to a wake or a funeral service. Whether or not, in the end, that's really what people who are the ones, the family or those who've lost the loved one, whether or not it's enough for them. I think we're probably a ways from that. Again, there's something about seeing people face to face and having people give you a hug or, shake your hand, or at least, again, look them in the eye. And that's just so important when you lose someone. But, maybe this is a kind of business that could augment a more traditional type funeral once we're back and able to do those kinds of things. And what I read about it, I think that they're considering that. And, right now, these online services are really only a small fraction of the overall industry. But we're talking about a $21 billion industry, the funeral business. So, even a little piece of that is big. So, I think it's going to be interesting. One of the things when I saw this article about it, it reminded me that just recently I binge watched this first season, only season at least so far, of this show. It's an Amazon show called Upload. And one of the big premises behind this, spoiler alert, is that you have the option of uploading to this other world, this other kind of ether world version of heaven. And, you can pay for this in advance, kind of like, pre-planning your funeral. You can pre-plan your afterlife. And, of course, along the way, you have to pay for all the extras, anything else you buy in this alternative universe. But what was funny was, and I guess I can say funny because I think it was meant to be, but they had the person who died was able to actually be there virtually at his own funeral. And people could see him and he could see them and they could interact. And it was, from a big screen, but it was as if he was, right there in the room with them. And, it was crazy. But, now that I'm seeing this about this other type of online approach to funerals, I don't know, maybe 30 years from now, it won't be so crazy. So, interesting. So that's an interesting show to check out, by the way. I'm not necessarily doing show promotions, but there's some interesting premises in that. And I don't think I gave all of it away, but because you'll find out pretty shortly into it what some of the themes are. So anyway, I think that probably does it. I think we've covered a lot of bases today, and I hope that perhaps you'll get a chance to explore some of these topics yourself a little bit more. A lot of very diverse topics we talked about today. And of course, there's a lot more we could talk about, and we will the next time we have our business news podcast. So I want to thank you for joining me today. Once again, I'm your host, Paula DuPont. And thank you for joining the GSMC Business News Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. And please remember to check out our Facebook page, Twitter, and Instagram, and let us know what you think of the show. And also, make sure you subscribe. Go to wherever it is that you get your podcast, and please subscribe to this one. Thank you, and have a great evening.
You've been listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.